Hello, I'm Paul Green, and I want to welcome you to our third and final video in the series Martial Arts and the Science of Learning. The first video that we did was, I believe it was on conceptual learning. The second one, memory and encoding. And this one is going to be the follow up to that on memory retrieval and some other things that I want to, put in there for you. Um, because you can talk about science all day long, but if you can't see how it's applicable to what you do, then, you can't really use it. So we want to, take it and apply it specifically to something that you can take and it's ready to go. And, talk about a couple of other topics with it that will hopefully be enlightening in some way. So to get things started, in memory retrieval, and we're going to talk about encoding some more too because that's a huge important thing. But we want to start off by talking about System 1 and System 2 cognition. And that's, kind of an important thing. You don't necessarily have to know the terms, but you kind of have to know what it is. You have a part of the brain or like a process called System 2, which is your normal thing. It's like, you sitting around decide where to eat, it's conscious, it's a slower process. Your eyes see something, it goes and hits all the relays and, whatever other part of the thing it's supposed to hit, and it's just a lot slower. Um, it has its place. It's just a more conscious thing. You think about System 2, you think about things like explicit memory and that type of thing, if you're familiar with that term. But the other part is the part that we're more interested in, which is System 1. And System 1 is kind of a shortcut that bypasses a lot of that, and that gets into your intuitiveness, your intuitive thinking, things that you do automatically. And we want to, reach that to, get our techniques, that are going to work and, and all that kind of a thing. So that's got to be where it starts. I made some notes here. It's late at night. I'm actually really tired. I don't want to get this done, so I made some notes of some things so I won't forget them. So if you see me keep looking down, Okay, now before we continue, and I'm going to harp on this a little bit more, during this video, you're not going to pull something out correctly that didn't go in correctly. Encoding is very, very, very important. I find that when I see, people doing things wrong, a lot of times it's not, well, subjectively wrong. Obviously, that would depend on context. But when I see them doing them wrong, it's not so much that they forgot them, but they never learned them correctly in the first place. Something, didn't go right in the attention phase, or repetition phase, or feedback phase. You're working with a partner that's too compliant, and that kind of a thing. So, that's really important. What we want to do here is you take these things that in System 1 and you're going to get them out with visual triggers, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But you want to implement something during the encoding phase that's going to initiate that retrieval. You don't have it at your disposal. And like I said, we're going to talk about exactly how to do that, give you physical examples of it, in the next few minutes, hopefully. Like I said, it is pretty late at night. So you're going to have visual triggers. Now, what happens is you're learning a technique or a sequence, for example, like we talked about in sequential learning, which there'll be more of that as well. And you do your repetition. You've gotten your feedback and everything you need. You paid attention. It got encoded well, and it gets stored to the point that it's automatic, to where it becomes something known as unconscious competence. It's one of the four phases of competence. That just means that it's nearly automatic, and it's stored in something called procedural memory. Now, procedural memory is a type of implicit memory. You think of like implicit memory uh, as your intuitive parts, and explicit memory is the stuff that you're more conscious. Very similar to thinking about System 1 and System 2 cognition. But we want to get it stored. Now, where we're going to use these visual triggers that I talked about is we're going to take our sequences, encode them correctly, be a good instructor, watch everything we're supposed to watch, and make sure that it goes well. And what we're going to do is use these visual triggers to pull those procedures out, those intuitive procedures, that the unconscious competence. Um, Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about intuition and and a few other things, because when you're dealing with things like sequential learning and that type of stuff, a lot of times it's unconscious. So back in the day, years ago, it was studied more as explicit memory, but in modern times, it's really looked more as implicit as well. I mean, it can be both, but we are more concerned with implicit or procedural memory. Which once again, procedural memory is the type of memory that, stores physical procedures like riding a bike or tying your shoe. You don't necessarily think about the physical act of tying your shoe. You just do it. You've done it so much. It's stored in there. It's stored in procedural memory. Um, as far as like these visual triggers, it's something that you already do. This isn't a foreign thing, but a lot of times it's not harped on as it should be. It's not a focal point of the training. And you get techniques down real good, but if you really want to get something as a procedure, focus on the ability to recognize the triggers, because that's what's going to tell you the sequence, to kick off, or, technique, or, however you want to do it. I prefer sequences, but that's what you want to do. Now, you want to build this to where it's intuitive. How do you know you can trust your intuition? And that's where it gets interesting. You know that you can trust your intuition when you've applied it to something. You have your repetition, your feedback, and then that unknown integer that's really not that unknown, predictability. When you have those three things that went into building that intuition, then you can trust it. You can trust it with repetition. Once again, you want to look at encoding errors. Um, the certain kinds of encoding errors that we talked about in the second video was like skipping certain techniques. How in the attention phase, how a lot of times folks are used to just learning techniques. They don't want to learn sequences. They're just learning techniques to get to the next thing, get to the next belt rank, or that type of a thing. And they get in this mentality where, okay, I'm doing this, this is in front of me, and this is the important thing. Okay, you move on to the next thing. Well, now this is the important thing, and I'm focusing on this. And it kind of is, but at the same time, what you want to do to catch them, to make sure that it's going in right, is put them together in a sequence. And you'll notice some things start getting missed over here, because when they originally learned it, that's, how their mind works, because that's what they're used to. As human beings, we tend to compartmentalize things like that. But you put it in a sequence and a build up, and you start seeing it. It becomes, visible, and you can see it. As an instructor, you can fix that now. Now I want to talk to you about a certain technique, that we do in building, these visual triggers, and give you an example. And training the police officers, we have, our techniques where we enter. Against a punch, we'll use something like this, because it's easier to teach right off the bat, um, and move in, and then we'll get a control, our base control, and it's something very similar. You see it in jiu-jitsu, you see it in karate, and some of the katas, but you come over, you overhook the arm, get it, grab this little notch, so you trap the arm here, then you put this into the neck. Looks kind of familiar, doesn't it? Looks kind of familiar. So you put this into the side of the neck, and driving in there. What you're doing is you're applying a stimulus to get that feedback. But when you're teaching this, you're going to start noticing things. Now, I'll tell you the technique that we do. It's a technique called a front quarter Nelson, and it comes from wrestling. It's a similar kind of an idea of a kite nagi in Aikido. We do it from a standing position, or a rotary throw. It's the same kind of an idea, but it's just applied a little bit differently. It's a little bit tighter, I think. But so we have the arm here, and his head starts to move down because we're applying pressure with this in the side of his neck, and he don't like it. So we applied that, and now we're starting to get the feedback. So when his head goes down, that's your trigger. So what we've done is, we applied this stimulus to this person to have them, give us a trigger. Now his head may not go down; it may do something else. For this example, we'll say it went down. Okay, now I just push on the crown of his head, push it towards his knees, slide this from here, grab there, do one of these movements, walk around, and I turn him and I get my takedown. And then there, I can do my restraint, on the ground, in a, like in a cuffing situation, in a law enforcement type thing. But excuse me. And, we can do that. But the thing, that I harp on, in the training is this technique is done, when his head moves down. Not that you pulled it down, because you'll see that when I have my arm up here on the side of the neck, I just leave it like this. I don't do that and put it on the back of the neck to try to pull his head down. You see, because if I were to do that and they felt it, there's space there from when he's straight up to where he's like, bending forward, that would be his body against my arm and he's going to win every time. And, obviously I don't want that. So, forcing the tactic that you want, and that happens a lot of times when you're doing repetition. They get used to doing it, they get complacent with it. But every time that you do a technique, you want to do it as if it's the first time that they've done it, even though it's not. So those are some things that you look for, because what's happening is if they pull down on the head, to try to do, the takedown, that you're teaching, instead of letting his head go down and just reading what he does, then the trigger's not getting encoded correctly. They're trying to force it. They're going to end up having to use one of the other ones, which they could, Some of the other ones, that you would do is if I did do that on accident and his head came back up straight, well, obviously I know not to do this now. That straight, that's information. That tells me something. That could be a trigger. What if he's here and he's moving back up and he's really fighting and I've got momentum, so I can use that to do a rear takedown of some sort. We have a couple of different ones that we do, based on the situation. But, you're installing triggers so that your students know, if I see this or I feel this, this is the thing that I can do. I'm trying not to be technique specific, because this stuff can apply to any martial art, but I needed an example, to illustrate it. But those are some things that, that you would look for in building these triggers. You see it like even in like a boxing class, um, where a person's telegraphing a certain combination they like. It's something that you all already do, but it just needs to be highlighted so that you do your encoding correctly, and then you go to retrieve it, but you need that trigger to do it. Otherwise, how would you know? You know, um, so that's another example. Um, Feedback. Let's see. I want to make sure that we covered everything. Let's see. Applying the stimulus. Okay, good. Now, predictability. That gets into a whole bunch of other things. Predictability. As human beings, our movement is in fact predictable. You see in a lot of martial arts, what I find really helpful, being a jiu-jitsu, guy myself, um, grappling. not necessarily on the ground, but standing up. Like different control holds that you might see in a police situation. In doing this, I cut off certain ways that the person can attack me. If I have control of this arm, they can't attack me with that. I'm too close for them to do anything with their leg. They've got to try something else. They've when I apply that stimulus of putting this here, they have to do something to try to beat it. Well, I know that one of the ways that they can try to beat it is they can get up under that arm or they can shrug that arm off. If they're straight up and down, they try to shove the arm off. Well, I have a sweep that I can do, like an osotogari type of a thing. And step out and do that. I have, rear head takedowns. If I feel like I'm losing the arm, I can switch from an arm control to a head control and do a takedown that way. Do like what they call like a puder kapala, in some martial arts, just like a rear takedown. I think we call that in Silat or some of the others. I hope I got that term correct. But you have those types of things. So the things that I apply, once again, there's a mathematical, aspect to it. And this, gets into the whole part of building sequences now. Um, as an instructor, in doing this, you've got to be humble. There's no such thing as a technique that can't be beaten. And that's something that you're going to have to be honest about. Because if you can't be honest about it, you're never going to get into these sequences to build this stuff. Your students are never going to have context. They're not going to have strategy for what they do. It's just going to be muscular exercises. Any technique can be beaten. Any technique that I teach can be beaten. That gets into the whole, can you pressure test a technique? Not really. You can pressure test a system, but that's a whole other video. We won't be covering that here, but that kind of gets into that territory. Like I said, I'll do a different video on that type of stuff. But any technique can be beaten. So what you do is you take a technique and you look at it honestly, and you look at, okay, what can a person do to defeat this technique? You put it in there and you let your students come up with ways to beat it. Show them that it can happen, because you don't want to have a false sense in something. You want to be realistic about it, because it matters. It's their life. It's important. So come up with different ways to beat it, and then take those ways that it can be mathematically beaten and use that as your visual triggers to store the procedures that you would use to beat it. In the police course that I do, all day two is, or at least the better part of day two is, I'm going to take an original technique. I'm going to let them come up with any way to beat it that they can. And they will. They want to beat it. They're excited to beat it, to prove the instructor wrong and all of that. Of course, they can't because of the way that it's set up theoretically. So they come up with ways to beat it. Well, then I'm going to take another technique that's from the course that I teach and use it to beat their counter. And in doing that, you start to build those sequences. But the way that they beat it is going to become the visual triggers that kick off that sequence. So you know how to have your own triggers that you created, that you can use, that goes with your lesson plans and your martial art. It doesn't have to, like I said, this isn't martial art specific. You can apply it to anything. You obviously know a lot more about what you teach than I do. We all, have our stuff. So, but that's, how those things are created. So when I have, this technique, I know that his head can go down. I also know that he could fight it and try to keep his head up. Or he could slip his arm out somehow. Maybe it's sweaty, or maybe he just knows how to get out of it. But I'm going to take those things and then come up with counters for it. And I'm going to use his escape as the visual trigger that beats it, that kicks off that sequence. And we're going to practice it that way. It needs to be some kind of there needs to be some kind of randomness in your training, or you're just doing muscular exercises. When you're first learning a technique, of course, you walk through it and you do it slow, and it's a static thing, but you can't, train static. You have to be honest about this stuff, and it's a lot more fun. You don't have to go 100 miles an hour. You can go at a slower pace and everything. Make sure people don't get injured and those type things. But you have to have some sort of randomness. Let's see. Let me pull this up. Like I said, I don't want to miss anything. Oh, that brings me to another cool thing, talking about predictability. Because we already talked about attention and encoding. We talked about feedback, and we talked about it a little bit more here. But I want to talk to you about another thing that's important, and why you need randomness in your training, and and to have your techniques beaten so that you can come up with a way to counter it. Because you want, if there's something wrong with something that you're teaching, you want to find out in class. You don't want them to find out in the street. Um, and I want to talk to you about another thing with predictability. As I mentioned, how combat or violent acts happen. A different way of looking at it. When we train in these things, we tend to look at them as techniques, and they are. That's honest. It's a technique. But I want to give you a different perspective. The example that I'm going to give you is like video. Like the one you're watching right now. Um, Video isn't obviously a static thing. It's video, not a picture. It's constantly moving. Just like a fight is constantly moving. You're not standing still generally in a fight. That would be a weird fight if you were. Uh, well, I mean, I'd probably like to see it, but that's not how fights go. They're chaotic. There's a lot of ragdolling and bumping against each other and hitting each other and all these types of things. When you One way that you can look at it is you take a video, and even if you've never done this, you can understand what I'm talking about. You take a video, and with most video programs, you'll have a thing on it called screen capture. And all screen capture is you hit a certain shortcut key, and it'll take a still photograph of a frame of that video. And that is why, when I teach these techniques, a lot of times to get people in the right mindset, I don't call them techniques, I call them reference points. And these are reference points that they work towards, because the techniques that you're teaching are not static, they're transitional. They're a still photograph of something that is in constant motion. So it kind of helps them out when it gets a little chaotic to know this is a reference point. Um, Sometimes, in your techniques, let's say, you have a circle and you have your techniques A, B, C, D, E, F, G, or whatever, and you're building sequences with your visual triggers and that type of a thing. Well, you know what? Sometimes it don't hit right on A. Sometimes it don't hit right on B. It hits kind of in between. But if you know this as a reference point, you still kind of know where to go next. Because, well, I'm comfortable with this technique, and when I like this one, I'm going to move my body in such a way that'll be here. And predictability is cool like that, because when you get it down really, really well, you can sometimes, if it falls within the probability, actually control the way someone attacks you without them knowing it. You can move in such a way that there are only so many mathematical possible ways that they can do it, and you use that to your advantage. So that goes into your intuitiveness. I'll give you another example. The video's getting close to that 30-minute mark. I don't want to go longer than I need to, but we have a technique. It's an old World War II technique called a bicycle. And all it is somebody standing, you're on the ground on your back, and you're just kind of kicking your legs at them, trying to kind of hyperextend the knee. If they come close, maybe kick them in the groin, from the ground, or even get a headshot. Um, it's I've seen it happen. Is it the best technique in the world? No, but I mean it's okay. And it's something you can work towards. Well, if somebody is at the end of your feet and they want to get around your feet to get to your torso and get around that barrier, it kind of works like a wedge. They have to go one way or they have to go another. And, can that technique be beaten? Sure, just like any other technique in the world. But they pick a side. Let's say they get this leg and they shove it this way, and so they're coming here. Well, you get what's called like a low single, where you can get, a variation of a single leg takedown there. So if I'm laying on my back and he's moving around, and and I'm starting to get tired laying down there, and I want to take him down to use that as a way. Maybe I'll move my feet and leave a little bit more of a gap than I should. And he picks that side as a setup for my takedown on him. And that type of thing. As I said, it's predictable. So in closing, you have your system one cognition. That's what we want to get to. We want to take our sequences that we've created based on the things, that I've told you. You have a technique and you study the ways that technique can be beat, and you pull from other things in your syllabus, to counter it. And you have like a little sequence there. You build your triggers and all that good stuff, and it gets stored as procedural memory. Um, becomes automatic and that type of a thing. And you learn to trust it. You learn to trust your intuition when you've encoded what you do correctly. You've had your attention and repetition and feedback and all of that. And now you get your repetition and feedback and predictability. And you can believe in what you do and you can be confident in it. But that's, basically memory retrieval. That's how you pull something out. During the encoding phase, you put those visual triggers in there based upon that. And that's pretty much it. I hope that you've enjoyed this 3 video series, and I hope that you've been able to pull something from it that you can use. And I really, really appreciate you watching it, and I hope it helps. Thank you very, very much for your time.